Hey, HannahMouse1 here. Welcome to a video in which I'll be making dioramas of myself and two close friends as Pokemon trainers, each with one of the three classic starters, Squirtle, Charmander and Bulbasaur. I started by making the bases for the dioramas, which I made to look like Pokeballs. To make the structure of these, I cut out 3 large circles of card for which I drew around a yogurt pot. I cut these out and did the same for 3 smaller circles using an old moisturizer pot as my guide. To keep the structure between these two pieces solid, I used rectangles of card as wide as the small circle's diameter. For each ball, I needed 2 of these rectangles, one of which I cut in half and fixed to the other so it had an X shape. I then stuck this to both the big and small circles using little L's of paper as hinges. Once I had that all solidly in place, I created the frame for the curve between the two by wrapping strips of paper around the curve and gluing it in place. For the top of the ball, I only want half of the ball to be present and completely hollow so that the diorama can go inside. To do this, I curved over an arc of paper, then repeated the frame making process with strips of paper that I did on the bottom half. I then completely covered the frame and the gaps in between with tissue. This makes up the body of the balls. I also added a strip of paper around the middle of each ball, which will become the black band that wraps around them. For the white button in the center, I stuck a small card circle onto a slightly larger one and then glued that to the strip that I just added to the ball right in the middle. I gave each ball a coat of gesso, which is an acrylic paint primer. This actually serves multiple purposes, giving me a white base coat to paint on, helping the paint to stick, and shoring up the flimsy tissue sections for later coats of paint. I decided to make each ball a different type of Pokeball based on the diorama within. For the fire diorama, I decided to stick with the classic red Pokeball, so I gave the top half its scarlet paint job. I also had to paint the inside of the ball, and I gave the button up front and the bottom half a touch up of white where the gesso wasn't cutting it. I also painted the base on the inside in a bright red. I'll add more detail later, but this was a good start. I painted the band around the center in black and did the same on the inside of the ball as well as on the back of the central white button. For the water Pokemon diorama, I opted to go with a dive ball. It seemed like an obvious choice. I painted both the top and bottom halves of the shell in wavy strips of blue. The lightest up top and the darker down below. I painted the inside of the shell in a mid-tone of blue and gave the button a coat of white. I went with a slightly greener shade of blue for the base platform. Eventually I want this to look like a shallow tropical pool, and this gives a good start point for that. I also did the black band on both the outer strip and the inside where the strip would be, and for the grass type I went with a nest ball for no real reason other than it was green and I thought it would look cool. For the upper half of the shell, I painted it in bright green but added strips of brown that curved around the ball. I did the inside of the shell in that same bright green, and the bottom half of this type of ball is like the basic ball white, so I touched up that and the button like I did on the red ball for the fire diorama. I painted the base platform in a foresty, almost what I would call camo green, and painted the band both within and without of the ball. With the bases painted, I needed to put something on them, so I made some tiny rocks. I made these by taking my craft knife to a big block of magic eraser and cut off some tiny cubes. Then I cut and sliced and pulled at these until I had something that looked like it could be natural. I actually lent into different shapes for these based on the diorama they went into, with the ones for the fire one being wider and flatter, and the ones in the plant diorama being taller and narrower and a bit more squat, the water ones being somewhere between the two. I gave each of these a coat of gesso, which was super important for these because sponges would just love to soak up any paint that I would apply, and gesso helped plug the holes and help the paint adhere nicely with a firmer surface for me to paint on. I then applied a base coat to each of the rocks, with the colour of this being dictated again by which diorama they were going to. For the water one, they were a very cool bluish green with a lighter dry brushing over top to add a bit of dimension and to highlight the bumps and ridges. I also added a band of dark grey around the base of each to indicate that water has lapped up against the rocks and that the bottom part of them is still wet. For the fire ones, they're a dark grey, almost black as the base coat. I gave them a red band around the base as though they're super hot, almost molten, and I added a much lighter grey to the tops and ridges of these. The plant-based ones are a much greener colour, warmer than those of the water diorama, and I used a light mossy green for the dry brushing details. Once these were totally dry, I stuck them onto the dioramas, considering in their placement how I want the figures to sit in amongst them, as well as their general evenness, symmetry and balance. I also wanted to add in some smaller bits of crumbling rock and charcoal to the fire diorama, so I took some crumbly chunks of an old failed PapierMache sculpt and painted them, as well as my fingers, in black for the most part, although I did a couple in dark grey for a bit of variety and visual interest. I then stuck these onto the fire diorama in little piles and clumps anywhere that I felt would benefit from being broken up a bit, as it makes it feel more organic and natural. I added some yellow and orange paint swirled onto any empty areas of the base to create a lava or magma effect. I really loved the effect of the small rock, so I decided to incorporate it into the other two dioramas as well, creating some small sandy yellow pebbles to go in the water diorama, as well as some slightly larger pebbles with a cool blue hue to act as a midpoint between the sand and the big rocks that I made earlier. I glued these down so that the biggest rocks are condensed around the edges, with small rocks arranged more sparsely in the center. I also glued on some felting wool to the rocks to make it look like moss or seaweed has grown in, making it feel a lot more natural. I needed a lot of these little rocks for the grass diorama in varying shades of desaturated green and brown. I wanted these to be packed in super densely, so I made an absolute ton and stuck them down, again concentrating them around the edges but also stacking them up into any gaps or crevices in or under or between the bigger rocks. I made the felting wool even more dense on this one with 2 different shades of green. I wanted it to look super mossy and overgrown. I then whipped up a batch of PaperMache so that I could make characters to go in the dioramas. I started with Squirtle, and this little guy is just brimming with energy. His little arms are waving in the air, he's hopping on one foot, he is just loving life. I gave him his curly tail and a ridge around the edge of the shell. Charmander was a bit calmer than his watery friend, although he's also waving his little arm nubbins happily. The most delicate part of this guy was his fiery tail, as this is a long thin protrusion that could easily get smashed or fall aside while drying, but I made it work, and it helped that these figures are absolutely tiny, thereby very light. Bulbasaur is the calmest of the bunch, just sitting, just chilling. I gave him his pointy ears, his squat body, and his big old bulb that is his namesake, but otherwise I get a kind of serene chill vibe from this little guy. Also made us trainers, making each part of the body, the head, the main torso, the limbs, as separate pieces, because these tiny pieces are super delicate and prone to smashing if I work on them as one big piece. I had to consider the poses that I wanted for these guys at this point and sculpt the limbs accordingly. For example, I wanted the trainer in the plant diorama to crouch down with his arms around his Pokemon, so I had to sculpt his legs at 90-degree angles with a slight curve to his arms. When it came to assembly, I stuck his body straight onto the Bulbasaur model where the other trainers will be standalone figures. I started off using PVA glue, but that was taking too long to dry and I was under a time crunch, so I switched to UV resin. For the fire trainer, she's upright with her limbs all outstretched and straight like they're struggling to balance, and for the water, he's running so all his limbs have a bit of a bend to them, and his weight will be all on one foot. With the models in one piece, I used more PaperClay for more details. For the plant trainer, I decided to give him a hoodie, and because the friend I base this off loves pandas, I decided to give him a panda beanie. I'm the fire trainer, so of course I gave myself my Hannah Mouse hoodie, and for the water trainer, I wanted him to be wearing shorts and a t-shirt because of the tropical setting, and I steered clear of any hats so I could show off my friend's iconic bottle blonde locks. I then painted the Pokemon. The paint job on the Pokemon was fairly predictable, with Squirtle sporting his bright blue head, limbs and tail, a sandy yellow belly and brown shell. For his corresponding trainer, I gave him a matching blue shirt, and of course he has his beach blonde locks. He's also barefoot because he's going to be running through water, for which shoes and socks would be wholly impractical. I gave Bulbasaur his green bulb and turquoise body. For his trainer, I gave a purple tint to the panda marks on his hoodie, as purple is his favourite colour, and I gave him black trousers to emphasise the pandaness. Charmander, again, was his bog standard orange with yellow stomach patch, and I also painted on the fire of his tail. And for me, I did the grey hoodie with the little pink ears, and gave myself dark grey trousers to match the charcoalish rocks of the diorama. With the base coats done, I added on tiny details like facial features and hoodie zippers, and I also touched up any white detailing that got a bit contaminated by the other paint, like the white in the plant trainer's hoodie or the white on Squirtle's shell, and I gave Bulbasaur purple eyes and did pink in the open mouths on any of the characters. I used UV resin to attach each model to their Pokeball bases. This stuff's great because it's so strong and dries in under a minute with a UV torch. I also added a layer of resin to any gaps between the rocks on the fire diorama, swirling laces of yellow and orange into it to make it look like lava. I did the same for the pool of water that the Squirtle and his trainer are splashing through, except this time I left it crystal clear, and I gave the resin a coat of Mod Podge, dabbing it onto the water to add surface texture and to make it look light and splashy, and stroking it onto the magma to make it look calmer, thicker and more viscous. I did the same gloss varnish on the central bands and buttons of each Pokeball, and a matte finish on the exteriors of the shells to add a subtler but still noticeable sheen. And that's them finished. What do you think? Which one's your favourite? Let me know, I'd love to hear some feedback on that account, and apart from that, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did, let me know if there's something to see more of. Join the Discord link down below, and I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!